Hey, welcome back. We're exposing variables to blueprints, and now we'd like to talk about exposing our components. This will allow us to set some of the properties, such as the meshes, on our static mesh components, as well as positioning our capsule and projectile spawn point. Now, we're back here in VS Code, and we have all of our test variables. And before we start going and exposing our private component variables, there's just a couple more uProperty specific things we need to learn about. For one, all of our test variables are in the public section, and a couple of our variables here are exposed to the event graph, allowing read access and write access, and these are not allowed in the private section. For example, if I take our visible anywhere int and edit anywhere int and cut these and paste them down here in the private section along with our components, here's what happens when we attempt to compile. Here we see in our terminal a couple of errors. We see blueprint read write should not be used on private members, and it says the same thing about blueprint read only. So what if we want read and write access in the event graph on private members? Well, there's a way to get around this. We can still have access to private variables in the event graph. We have to add another input to the uProperty macro, and that input looks like this. We say meta equals parentheses allow private access equals, and in quotes, true. Now, this looks pretty weird. It's sort of a nightmare of syntax, but this is what it looks like. uProperty macros allow for metadata, and metadata is just a fancy word for data that gives information about other data. So we have this meta equals, and if we use allow private access equals true, then we can expose these variables to the event graph even though they're private. Now, if you're a stickler and you don't think giving private access to a variable is a very good idea, well, you don't have to do this. This is just another tool in your toolbox that allows us to expose private variables to Blueprint. And on the C++ side, these are still private. You still can't access these from other classes, so you have that encapsulation on the C++ side. This just gives you the ability to get these in Blueprints and make changes to them. And really, in Blueprints, it's kind of a different world. Typically, you're not going to expose things to Blueprints that someone could go in and change and potentially break the game. But it's useful to know how to do this, so we're going to give this meta allow private access to both visible anywhere int and edit anywhere int. So let's compile this. And now we see we have a successful compile, even though we have blueprint read write and blueprint read only on variables in a private section. Now back here in bppon tank in the event graph, I can right click and type edit anywhere, and here we see get edit anywhere int. We still have access to it, and if I search for visible, I see visible anywhere int. We can get and set it. Now the last thing I'm going to show you that we can add to uProperties is a category. Notice here in the details panel, these variables we've added are under this category basepawn. This is the name of the class, and that's where they go by default. But notice that we also have other variables inherited by this class, and they're each in their own categories. Now we can create our own category for these exposed variables, and we do that by adding category equals, and in quotes, we can give this a category. So I could call this super duper variables. Now I'm going to have a comma here because I placed this here in the uProperty macro as one of the inputs, and all of the inputs have to be separated by commas. I'm going to copy this and add it to the uProperty here for edit anywhere int as well. So now these should be in their own category called super duper variables. Let's compile. And back here in the editor, check this out. We have super duper variables, and our variables are here. And I can right click in the event graph, search for super, and check it out. We have super duper variables, and our variables are here. So this is a nice way to organize our variables and make them a little bit easier to find. So I've added a couple new things to our table here. We can give private access. We can take private variables and still expose them to the event graph with this meta specifier. And we can also give variables their own category to organize them in Blueprints. So now that you know plenty of ways to control the access to our variables in Blueprint, you're going to fill out the uProperty for the components. Now, decide their access levels. You're going to want visible anywhere for these, because edit anywhere is not something you want to give to your components. This means you can actually edit that pointer variable, and we don't want to change the pointer. It should always point to the object we constructed in the constructor. But you can also decide whether or not to give them read-write access in the event graph. Give them a category. This will allow us to keep our variables organized. Now, if you're going to give them blueprint read-write or blueprint read-only, you'll need to allow private access with that meta specifier because these are private variables. Now, once you've exposed the components to blueprints, then you can set some properties in the default blueprint. You can give the static mesh components their own static meshes, so set that up in both the pawn tank and in the turret blueprint, and position the capsule so it's roughly encompassing the volume of the meshes, and position the projectile spawn point. Place it at a point that would make sense for projectiles to spawn from. So pause the video and expose our components to Blueprint. Okay, so here we are in our private section, and we'd like to expose these components. Now, first I'm going to give my capsule component visible anywhere. And I'm going to just decide to give this blueprint read-only, so I can access the capsule comp variable in the event graph, but I cannot set it. Now, I'm going to give these the category, and for our components here, I'm just going to give it the category components. Now, because I'm using blueprint read only, I'm going to use meta allow private access equals true. So I'm going to put that right there. And for the rest of my components, I'm happy with these same uProperty specifiers. So I'm going to give them all the same specifiers. Now I'm going to compile this. And back here in the editor, I'm going to click on the viewport so I can actually see what I'm doing here. And I can select base mesh. And for the static mesh property, since we're in the pawn tank blueprint, I'm going to choose tank base. That's the base of the tank. Now I can select the turret mesh, and for its static mesh, I'm going to select tank turret. And now our tank blueprint actually looks like a tank. Now, before I set the projectile spawn point, I'd like to adjust the capsule component so it's roughly encompassing the volume of the mesh. Now, with the capsule component selected, we have these properties capsule half height and capsule radius. I'm going to scale the radius and the capsule half height just so that this is looking like approximately the correct shape. And I'm going to need to position my tank so that it's down at the bottom because our capsule component is the root component. We have to move all other components relative to the root. So I can select the base mesh and move it down. And to get it just right, I can angle my view like this, or I can come up here where it says perspective and select right. And I'm now in orthographic mode. This places everything on a plane so I can move things and get them just right. Now I'm going to turn off snapping so I can position this more precisely, and I think that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go back into perspective mode so I can see this and make sure everything looks good. And I'll select my capsule component and make sure the scale is just right. Now this may take a little bit of adjusting to get right, but with a few tweaks you can get it looking pretty good. So I'm satisfied with this. Next, I'd like to position the projectile spawn point. I'm going to turn snapping back on and move it up just in front of the barrel here. So this is looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now it's time to set BP pawn turret. So here in BP pawn turret, I'm going to set the base mesh. So let's select the tower base. And I'm going to set turret mesh to tower turret. There we go. Now I'm going to scale up the capsule comp and move the base mesh down and just tweak this until I get it just right. And again, I can go into orthographic view and turn off snapping and get this positioned approximately the way I'd like it and go back into perspective. I think that looks pretty good. Now the last thing is the projectile spawn point. I'm going to turn snapping back on and position it right here in front of the barrel. And I'll set the snapping increments to 5 just so I can position it right in the front there. Now make sure that the projectile spawn point is not too close to the barrel. We're going to be spawning projectiles from this point. And something that's tripped up some students is that their spawn point is too close to the barrel and there's a collision there, which can result in complications when spawning projectiles. Now, this can be easily solved by making sure the spawn point is a good distance away from the barrel, and we'll polish this up at the very end of this section of the course. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is place a few of these in the world. I've already got a BP Pond tank here. I'm going to set that down on the ground, and let's drag in a couple instances of BP Pond turret. I'm going to place one here and rotate it so it's facing outward. And then I'll go ahead and just place one at each corner here so that they can guard this central structure. And this is looking a little bit more like the finished product. There we go. And of course, if I wanted to, I could view this from the top. And in top orthographic mode, I can position these more precisely. But of course, this is a little bit less important. In a polished game, you're going to want everything to look just right. Okay, back to perspective mode. This is looking pretty awesome. So referring back to our section plan, we've created our tank, and our goal is for it to move throughout the world. So in the lectures to come, we're going to start learning how to do that. So in this lecture, we have exposed our components to blueprints, and we've set some properties in the blueprints for the tank and for the turret. Excellent progress. I'll see you in the next video.